Thank you so much. As Bettina, Lucia, and Philippa said, we are delighted to welcome you all to The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish, the understory of the understory. This event is part of our General Ecology project, which has existed, as Bettina said, since 2018. Although our engagement at the Serpentine with ecology dates back to the Extinction Marathon and the long-term collaboration with the artist Gustav Metzger. Gustav told us we need to take a stand against the ongoing erasure of species. It's our privilege, it's our duty to be at the forefront of the struggle. While humanity has moved through extreme crises in the past, time and speed is of the essence. The Extinction Marathon addressed the ongoing environmental degradation that threatens our ecology through the loss of valuable animal and plant species, as well as cultural phenomena which risk to disappear through the homogenization in the world. We honor and continue his commitment this year with the 50+1 anniversary project, Back to Earth, which invite artists to respond to the climate emergency with an artwork that is also an environmental campaign. As Alexis Pauline Gumbs, thinking with Sylvia Wynter, and Sylvia Wynter's multiple histories of knowledge recently said, we have the opportunity now as species fully in touch with each other to unlearn and relearn our own patterns of thinking and storytelling in a way that allows us to be actually in communion with our environment, as opposed to a dominating colonialist separation from the environment. Back to Earth is both a program about change and also a catalyst for change. The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish, the understory of the understory, is the fourth installment of this year-long festival and research project. And it's curated by Lucia Pietro-Justi, Philippa Ramos, as the previous fish were curated by them as well, so brilliantly, together with Kostas Stasinopoulos, also produced by Holly Shuttleworth with the involvement of Giles Round. At the Serpentine, we are always inspired by and learning from our collaborators. So by way of a taster and teaser to what's coming over the next 2 days, I sat down with the anthropologist Tim Ingold to ask him about his research on ground and his new and beautiful book, Correspondences. Tim Ingold is Professor Emeritus of Social Anthropology at the University of Aberdeen. Ingold's current interests lie on the interface between anthropology, archaeology, art, and architecture. His recent books include The Perception of the Environment in 2000, Lines in 2007, Being Alive in 2011, and Making in 2013. Tim Ingold has been concerning himself with a fundamental question: what on earth is ground? This is something he has explored at length in Correspondences, and the talk he's going to presenting tomorrow continues this philosophical investigation. Thank you all so much, and a very warm welcome to Tim Ingold.
So I wanted to begin with the beginning, and I wanted to ask you how it all began, because I read that your father made research with fungi and spores, and that in a way your home was always, when you grew up, a kind of a laboratory. The living room was a laboratory. Can you tell us a little bit about how it all began and how you then, based on this childhood experience, came to anthropology?
Well, yes, I grew up in a household, a scientific household, where my dad was quite a prominent mycologist, and his particular interest was in microscopic fungi, what are called aquatic hyphomycetes, which live in the scum that collects on the banks of rivers, small rivers. As they go along through the woods, you get these patches of scum. And he would go down, walk by the riverbank and pick up some of this in a glass tube, glass vial, and bring it home and put it under the microscope. And the microscope was set up on our dining room table. And so he could watch these fungi, and he was interested in how they developed, in their mechanisms of spore discharge. And he would draw them using an Indian ink and a mapping pen on white card, and he produced these beautiful drawings. And so that's the environment I grew up in. I went to university because it was just assumed that I was going to be a scientist. So I went up to university to do natural sciences, and after a year of that, figured that I had nothing against science, but I couldn't possibly see how I could be a scientist. So I looked around at all the different things you could do, and I wanted something that would combine, that would overcome the boundaries between the humanities and the natural sciences, but also somehow be close to the ground, close to experience. So that took me into anthropology, and I've always tried to explain to my dad, he never understood, but I tried to explain that just as in the biological sciences, fungi don't behave as organisms are supposed to behave. They just always, they're awkward. They spill out, they create relationships where they're all over the place. And it's a bit the same with anthropology and the social sciences. That people too are all over the place. And so I tried to explain to him that actually anthropology is to the social sciences as mycology is to the biological sciences. So it was all entirely logical that I should become an anthropologist. And that's the background in brief.
Now, obviously, there is a lecture also of yours, What on Earth is Ground, a lecture which is very inspiring for our project Back to Earth. And some of this lecture is, of course, collated also in correspondences.
Indeed.
And you ask a number of really important questions in this lecture about the notion of ground. Can you cut it? Can you roll it? Can you make holes in it? The ground eludes these questions, you write. So I wanted to ask you about this and also about extraction, fracking, building, astroturf, because of course in the Anthropocene, the ground is something you can roll, you can cut and makes hole in it. So in a way, the question is, has human industrialization transformed the very notion of the ground?
Well, in a way it has. I mean, what has happened with industrialization is perhaps more the illusion rather than the reality that the Earth is hard surfaced. So that, and for example, one of the structures that promotes this illusion of a hard surfaced world is the factory chimney. And what a factory chimney does, which after all is a sort of symbol of icon of industrialization, and what a factory chimney does is to hide inside the site at which real transformations are going on, involving interactions between earth and sky, that is the fire, where the fire is burning, and then to make sure that the fire is obscured sort of underneath, and the smoke is way up, coming out of the chimney, high up at the top. So what the chimney does is to reinforce an absolute division between the earth and the atmosphere. But it hides what is really going on, because if any manufacturing is taking place that involving conversions of energy and power, there's usually a fire burning somewhere. And fire involves combustion, it involves air mixing with substances from the earth. If you're burning wood or coal or whatever it might be, then that only happens because this division between the atmosphere and the earth is confounded, that the two mix together, and there'll be no combustion without that. So the factory chimney hides or perpetuates the illusion that earth and atmosphere are completely separate, and that the ground represents an interface between the two, like a hard layer. But it is an illusion, because unless the earth and the atmosphere were actually actively reacting with one another, there would be no power, no energy, no industry at all. Likewise, if the earth was completely hard surfaced with asphalt or concrete or whatever, there could be no life anywhere, because for there to be life at all, there has to be the plants to grow. They need earth, they need moisture, they need sunlight. So they have to break through. So the plants break through the cracks in the hard pavement. In a city pavement, the plants grow through the cracks and eventually break them apart. But modernity and the industry that sustains it has conspired to create this illusion that we live our lives on a kind of platform that is layered over the earth, a sort of crust, so that we live on it, and then there's the earth beneath, and we're on top, and the ground then appears as an interface between the two.
Now, in the book, but in your writing also in general, you often establish a connection between the repeated inscription and also the erosion of parchments, palimpsest in a way. So marks that life makes on the ground by, I mean, we could say maybe walking or growing or sprouting or plowing, are part of that. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about this notion of the inscription, the interaction of life and earth. And it brings us back to the idea also of writing, of letter writing, human writing. And the question if, human writing then is an emergence from a more ancient form of inscription, maybe a deep time kind of interaction between life and the ground?
Some people think it does, and I think in ancient China, which after all has one of the oldest writing systems in the world, there's this idea that that writing evolved from the marks of the patterns of bird marks in the sand or in the mud. So a bird is walking along and it leaves these little traces of its toes in the mud, and writing comes from that. I don't know whether every system of writing goes back with that sort of image, but and of course Chinese writing is very particular because Chinese writing is a very gestural kind of writing, and so naturally it follows on from the idea of somebody moving around and leaving a trail on the ground as it goes. But that's etymologically where it comes from. After all, the word for to write etymologically in the English word or the equivalent words in other European languages comes from, I think, the Anglo-Saxon ritan, which means to scratch a mark in stone. And of course the graphein in Greek also has that idea of scratching or scraping a mark. And what's interesting is what's happened to this notion of writing as we move towards modernity, that a word that originally meant some form of scratching, scraping, or at least some form of line making, whether by scratching or by using a pencil or a brush, has moved to a sense entirely of verbal composition. So when we talk about a writer nowadays, we don't pay any attention to the marks that writer makes. You simply say, well, the writer is somebody who's composing words on a keyboard or whatever they're using, and it's got nothing to do with the mark making. Of course, in medieval times, the scribe was the one who was making the marks, and often scribes didn't even understand what they were writing. They were just told what they were supposed to write, and they got on with it. So it's actually the craft of line writing was the craft of line making, rather than the art of the wordsmith as it is now.
You wrote a lot also about the tension actually between what we have prepared and mastered and the unknown, no? Sort of the balance between imagination pushing out into the unknown and the perception seeing what is already there. And if you think about that, I wanted to ask you about the future. And of course, in a way, when we think about Back to Earth, it's also about a longer term project. It goes beyond the time frame of an exhibition. I mean, Fernand Braudel talks about la longue durée, and we've been particularly fascinated by the book The Good Ancestor by Roman Krajanic, how to think long-term in a short-term world. Because Roman basically says we are, in a way, stuck in short-termism. And one of the reasons for this environmental crisis and this very general crisis is this short-termism, and we need to liberate ourselves from this short-termism. And he says there are basically 6 ways to think long. There is deep time humility, there is legacy mindset, there is intergenerational justice, there is cathedral thinking, there is holistic forecasting, and then last but not least, there is a transcendental goal. So then thinking about the idea that we are in this tension between what we can plan and what is unknown, how do you see this long durational aspect? How can we think long term in a short term world?
The way I see it is that there's when we start talking about nested scales of time, like short term nesting into the medium term nesting into the long term, and so on. When we think about all these scales of time, each one nesting into a bigger one and a bigger one and a bigger one, we are ourselves taking a position from outside it all. We are assuming a transcendental perspective. You can't see the nesting of the short term in the long term from inside. It's like if you're sitting in one room in your house, you can't see the whole house as a nested series of rooms. You see it rather as a series of paths that lead from one room to another. And so there is a way in which we can, if we move down from that sort of God's eye view, from that transcendental perspective, into a position in medias res, in the middle of things, then this distinction between the short and the long actually collapses. What we see is an eternity in every moment. And that, I think, is the way forward. I mean, indigenous people wouldn't make this distinction between short-term and long-term processes. But it doesn't mean that some people have argued that therefore they're just suspended in a perpetual present. It's the point that the present they're in is one in which they're intensely present in the world, and in being present in the world, they you can sense deep time from within. So just imagine you go to the beach and you're watching the waves rolling in, and you say, oh, a wave, it's a short-term thing, it's a phenomenal, it's ephemeral. That wave, a few seconds and it's broken and it's gone. That's the end of it. No more wave. You think waves short-term. But then you think, but these waves have been coming in and breaking on this shore for millions of years, for as long as anybody cares, as long as longer than there have been any humans around. So that actually to attune your consciousness to the waves is absolutely not to be caught in that present moment. It's to see that in that present moment is a whole eternity. And I really think that's what we have to do. I think we have to move out of thinking of short-term versus long-term, stop thinking in terms of nested scales of time, and see how every moment is one which in fact is a moment of beginning for the world as a whole. It's this idea of the world in continuous birth. And that requires a different temporal sensibility. I think it's one you find in children and very old people, which you don't find in people of the middling ages. But kids are not geared up to short versus long-term perspectives. And very old people forget about all that stuff. For them, the short and the long are all mixed up together. And I really think that by bringing children and old people together and tapping into that sense of time that they share. That's the way to rethink time and planning and everything else.